And so they used collectively this dynamic of blood quantum and a pogrom of miscegenation in order to supplant the indigenous people. And so we're going to look very briefly at how some of this took place. And if people were being honest about their research in terms of their ancestry research, you would already have a better handle on this. But what's happening is people are really set on presenting a particular narrative, and often that narrative is that they are 100% or full blood Indian, whatever the heck that means. So they are invested in that, and so therefore they will not tell you the full narrative of their ancestry. But if they told you the full narrative of the ancestry, you'd get a better picture of exactly what has taken place. And so through my own research, I can see it very clearly, just looking at my own family, exactly how this supplanting took place. And that is the actual word, that's the actual construct that is going on here. And so what we're going to do is quickly look at the spin that allowed all of this to take place and why it continues today. And so part of the foundation of the takeover, if you will, was the supplanting of the matrilineal inheritance dynamic. And so there were a few things going on. So there was a miscegenation program that was going on. And then there was this theory of this blood quantum that makes no natural sense. And it doesn't even make legal sense. It doesn't even comport with the way we understand inheritance in terms of the law. So it's very odd that it even exists. But the big part that was really going on was this dynamic of chattel. And no, I'm not talking about chattel slavery. I'm talking about what happened with females when European males came into the American space. And so many of the family groups, according to the narrative, they were matrilineal. They call them tribes, clans, family groups. They were matrilineal, and so the inheritance passed down through the mother's line. And of course, you can imagine why you would want to have this matrilineal dynamic. But the matrilineal dynamic presented a number of problems when it encountered this patriarchal dynamic. And not only do you have patriarchal dynamics, but you also have this chattel dynamic. And so what came over from Europe was the construct of women as property. And yes, I mean actual property. And it wasn't just women, it was women and children. And so women didn't actually have the right to an identity, an independent identity. Their identity was subsumed under the male identity. And so that's part of the reason why it's very difficult to do ancestry research also, because what happened with the clashing of the cultures was an erasure. And we're going to talk about how this chattel dynamic with women and how this erasure dynamic sort of, met, how they came together to create the situation that we've been dealing with and that people were dealing with in the past. So this legal construct that you need to familiarize yourself with, if you are not familiar with it, is this idea of coverture. And so coverture is about sort of covering, concealing. And historically, it was the legal status of women. Now, there's a tendency to focus on the legal status of married women, but even if a female was single, she was still sort of under the cover of the father. Now, this is, of course, very helpful in many instances, but when you have a colonization dynamic, then it becomes very, very complicated. And so with coverture coming over with the colonization, there was the simultaneous, with the conquest dynamic, there was a simultaneous erasure of the matrilineal and the patrilineal. So there was the attempt at destroying the patrilineal, so the male lines, and then replacing them with the European male lines. This did a few things. First of all, the history of the paternal line became erased. The paternal line became erased, period. And then the woman was subsumed under this coverture dynamic. So not only is this paternal line lost, but now the maternal line is lost because the only name that got passed down was the European name from Europe. And so there's a complete erasure of what was in place in the Americas. And so the woman's lineage just disappears. And so you might have noticed this if you're trying to trace ancestry. It's very, very difficult to do it. And part of the reason for that is the erasure of the matrilineal. And so this was done by coverture, which of course means concealing. So that was the hiding of the woman's identity. You no longer even know her father's name. Now, some people in some cultures are very smart. What they do is they give the children the mother's maiden name as the middle name. And so this is a way of keeping that line going. And you might even notice this in some of your families, that the maiden name of the mother is a child's middle name. And so therefore, that lineage, that name, that line continues on, only it's a middle name, but at least it's there. Because if that's not there, it's just very difficult to trace the maternal line. And there was also an erasure of the people. There was a period of time wherein Indigenous people were not even in the census. And so it was very difficult to figure out exactly what was going on in terms of an individual history. And then on top of that, the surname, came up. And so people took on these surnames out of marriage in many instances, or in some other instances based upon chattel slavery dynamics. And so, yes, with the Indians, with the indigenous people, that same dynamic took place. And so the names that people have right now in terms of indigenous people, those, of course, were not their fathers' names. Okay, so those original male lines, they have pretty much been erased simply by giving of the surname. We don't even know if surnames were even used prior to the time of colonization. But so this is what happened in terms of the matrilineal erasure of the indigenous people and the patrilineal erasure of the indigenous people. Now, the other thing that took place was miscegenation, which of course is what this is all about. And so miscegenation was used as the tool for the erasure, not just socially in terms of name, but in terms of that whole blood quantum thing. Miscegenation was used in order to dilute. And we're going to look at a theory about why this was taking place. And so just to refresh your memory, miscegenation is about mixing. And so you tend to think of it in terms of a marriage or cohabitation between individuals who are purportedly of different racial groups. Of course, there is no clear line of demarcation for all of this, but anyway, that's what is going on here. Now, with respect to the indigenous people, the miscegenation was really about that dilution with the blood quantum, but it was also about the dilution of rights. And here you can see that the first known use of this word, interestingly, is 1863. And so this word, as an English word, it didn't exist until the interesting time of 1863. Okay, so miscegenation was the tool, but miscegenation was part of a pogrom. And a pogrom is basically an organized way of destroying a group of people. And so if you reflect on the narrative of what took place centuries ago, you can clearly see that this was a pogrom. And so again, a pogrom is a process, a program essentially, to massacre or destroy a group of people. And according to Webster's dictionary, the first time that this word appeared was in 1891. And so the strategy for this destruction, as you will see when we look at some literature, was the genetic splicing. And so there was the splicing of the indigenous genetic line. And there was the splicing initially, the focus was on splicing with European genetics. However, there was another program or program of splicing with African and Asian genetics. And so the splicing focus was on the maternal line. It included the paternal lines also, but a heightened focus was on the maternal line. And this could have been because there was a cultural dynamic of matrilineal descent. And so we're going to look at some fruit as we are looking at these examples of this indigenous splicing. And so, as you know, there are types of vegetation that are indigenous to particular places in the world. They originate in particular places. They are native to particular places. And so what was happening was that other lines were being introduced. And you see this with some fruit. In some histories, you see that, not all of the fruit that we have today always existed. There was some splicing, mixing and blending with various other lines in order to create a new type of fruit. And so that's the same thing that you had with this pogrom. And so, of course, starting off, when you have a collective of people, you have the people essentially being the same. And so you had the fruit on one side, the X fruit and the Y fruit being essentially the same. But with the pogrom that took place, there was a replacing of the X or the replacing of the Y. And again, the focus was on replacing of the Y. There was a heightened focus on that. And so here you can see an example of this with the plums and peaches. Um, on one side, you have an XY of the peaches. And then on the other side, you have an X and a Y of the plums. And so part of the pogrom was to increase the rate of the peaches with the X mixing with the plums of the Y, and the Y's of the peaches mixing with the X's of the plums. Hopefully this is making sense. And so another thing that started to happen was an agenda of bringing everyone together, creating this amalgamation. And what happened was there was a push towards having European, African, and Asian mix with the indigenous people. And so there was a focus on erasing the indigenous people by sort of genetically overcoming them with these various other lines. However, common sense dictates that I don't care how many mixtures you come up with, your grandparents are going to still be your grandparents. they can come up with these blood quantums of, 1/100th. It doesn't matter. Your grandparents are your grandparents, and they remain your grandparents no matter how many people their descendants mix with. It doesn't change that. It never changes throughout time. And so, in terms of the laws of nature, blood quantum is ridiculous. And in terms of the law, blood quantum is ridiculous. However, for whatever reasons, individuals are not challenging it the way that they should be challenging it based upon the law of nature and the actual law, common law, statutory law. It just doesn't make any sense. But here we are living with this fallacy, and part of that it's sort of a delusion that we are collectively laboring under. It's a falsehood, but we are all operating as if it is some sort of truth. And so there's a problem with that cognitively, but we're not going to get into that right now. So anyway, you can see here this dynamic of how this whole thing was playing out and what the game plan was. And so here we have the treatise on this whole miscegenation dynamic. And so this text is talking about why miscegenation is essential. Very interesting. And so it goes through a number of scenarios to paint a picture of positivity related to miscegenation. Now, according to the narratives in the text, there is a focus on one particular group significantly benefiting from miscegenation, also resulting in the erasure of other groups. There is also a focus on erasing the distinctions, period, and having everyone again sort of being this amalgamation. We're going to look at some of the topics that are covered. You'll be able to see them, but then we're going to dive right into what the pogrom was with respect to the American Indians. And it's also kind of interesting referring to people as American and Indian at this point, because that word American really means Amorite or Amoree. And then you have these other dynamics with the word Indian. So all of it is just very interesting. But you can see here in the table of contents all of these interesting topics that are inside of this particular text. And so there is a belief in the superiority of those who come about through miscegenation. And so that's what's being pushed, because the miscegenation is being pushed. And so there is this offering that individual groups are weaker than the mixed groups of people. Oh, this text gets very interesting. Okay, so it talks about how certain groups can benefit from this. It also talks about the secret love affairs that different cultural groups have with other cultural groups. So it's very interesting narratives inside of this text. Very odd. And so then part of the narrative is that the future will be no distinct groups of people. There will just be this miscegenation. And here we have the pogrom, and it indicates here that the most remarkable dynamic of the New World is this extraordinary commingling of diverse groups of people. And so it's pointing out that one thing that has happened that has been wonderful, according to this particular narrative, is that diverse people from Europe are shaken together and amalgamated in the New World until the original distinctions disappear. And what they were going for, according to this, is a new national type being formed. The author goes on to indicate, moreover, as we have seen, these white Americans are blending to some extent with the native red stock of the continent. Within a century from the present time, we may expect to see the separate existence of the red man and his hunting grounds swept away, and an ethnographically composite yet socially homogeneous population existing all over America. And so this is the pogrom that was put in place. This is what was initiated. And this is a part of what was behind the removals. And so the individuals who were removed, in fact, were generally those individuals, if they even were indigenous, those individuals who were sufficiently amalgamated. That was a part of that whole civilized dynamic, these civilized tribes, this focus on civilization. And you hear people focus on civilization. This was the first civilization. This was the best civilization. And so there's a lot of focus on civilization. But that's what was taking place with respect to this particular pogrom. And so it's not something that took place accidentally, really. This was a part of a plan. So the author goes on to indicate that this commingling with Europe and America, that's not enough. And so it indicates that this strange commixture of population doesn't stop there. Not only Europe and America, but Africa and in a lesser degree Asia will be represented in the new race, which is growing up in the new world. And the way that Asia would be brought in was through the Chinese settlers in California, who are identified as the vanguard of a more numerous immigration that would be coming later. And so you had one group coming from the Atlantic, or two groups basically coming from the Atlantic, and then another group descending on America through the Pacific, and somehow all meeting in the middle with one purpose, ultimately, in terms of this mixing, to erase what was originally in place. And where have we heard that term, the vanguard, before? And so there is a specific section in this text about this mingling. And this is coming from the North British Review, and it's in answer to a question. And the question is the red race doomed? And the answer is in the affirmative, but it's indicating here that it's not for the reason that people might be thinking. And so it is stated here that the red man will indeed disappear, but not wholly by extinction. So in other words, not by complete destruction. The lessening of the numbers will be brought about, according to this, by the absorption into the supplanting ethnic groups. Okay, so they are indicating here that the miscegenation is the tool by which the disappearance will take place. Because essentially, with all of this mixing, the indigenous people would eventually become indistinguishable from the Europeans, indistinguishable from the Africans, indistinguishable from the Asians. And so that's the purpose here. And so therefore, their independent, unique existence would be diminished. That's the goal. And it explains here how this is carried out. So you've got the coverture dynamic, You have the chattel dynamic. And so that chattel dynamic applied to American Indian women also. So it's not like it only applied to European women. It was the identity, the legal identity of women. And that coverture dynamic was a legal dynamic that applied to all women in what was to become the United States. And so it indicates here at every fresh stage of colonization or of pioneering into the Wild West, the work has necessarily been accomplished by the hardy youths or the hunters and trappers of the clearing. Now, part of this dynamic right here is why you hear people getting up in arms related to the current migrant situation. You'll often hear people talk about many of the migrants, whether we're talking about Europe, whether we're talking about America, many of the migrants appear to be what are thought of as military age men. And so they tend to be young men, unaccompanied sometimes. And so there's this conquest narrative that is running in relation to when men of military age show up in any particular space that is not their own space. And so it goes on to indicate here, rarely indeed did they carry with them wives or daughters. So what does that mean? Now, of course, there were some women that came, but by and large, we are not talking about large collectives of women making these trips initially. And so it goes on to indicate here, but where they found a home amid savage haunted wilds, they took to themselves wives of the daughters of the soil. The daughters of the soil. That's who they took. That's who came under the coverture. That's whose identity disappeared. That's whose identity was erased. And even in situations where you had individuals who had property, so the indigenous women might have had property, but under the whole dynamic of coverture, their property became the property of the husbands. They didn't have an independent identity. They were not legal entities. And so that's how the pogrom worked. There was a combination of social dynamics, psychological dynamics mixed in with these biological dynamics and the law.